Okay, welcome folks. I'm going to start by going through the mark scheme, which is actually very interesting in the EPQ. It's much more complicated, I feel, than most marking. I'll start on this first page with you and just point out that, as you can see, there are 4 assessment criteria. AO1, which is the manage, AO2, which is the sources, AO3, that's 40% of the entire mark, which they call develop and realize, and I'll go into a lot more detail in a minute. And then there's AO4, which is the review, the kind of self-evaluation element of it. Now, in the mark scheme, there are 3 broad bands. The top band is clear, the middle band is some, and the bottom band is limited. And at desk, we don't use this band very often because they actually do get quite a lot of supervision, etc. Okay? Now, what I wanted to point out first of all is that this is holistic marking. So there's no part of the project that you would mark in isolation. You mark it like an organic whole. And that means that the production log, that's the diary Project Q software that we use in this school, is taken together with the report and the artifact, if there is an artifact. The presentation is also an important part of the assessment. And then all of the appendices, things like the presentation slides, evidence of the planning, evidence of note-taking, etc., interview transcripts. This appendices can be a very important source of marks, okay? So I'm going to begin with AO1, the manage criteria, okay? Can you all see that clearly? And as you can see, there are 4 subtopics. The first being identifying the topic, the second being establishing aims and objectives, producing a project plan, and then completing it to the standards of the aims and objectives, okay? So where do we look for these different pieces of evidence? Well, first of all, to identify the topic, you would look in the introduction of the report. You would look to see the report or the artifact has a very clear aim. Of course, the main place to look for the aims and objectives is the production log. I'll write Project Q here because most of us know the production log as Project Q. And that would be things like the candidate proposal, where they identify the title. Let me just remind you, though, that in the EPQ, it's actually desirable for the students to change their mind on a number of occasions. So don't be mistaken by thinking the students need to immediately identify what their aims are. It's an organic process like all research. So it's kind of modeled on something like a master's degree, where you might have a shifting research question as your data throws up new results. So as long as the students are in their production log discussing these changes and making them really clear, that can be a really important thing. Now, of course, they have to produce a project plan, and that could be in many different ways. That could be a simple calendar, that could be some kind of table, or it could be something more technical like a Gantt chart, which they do learn as part of the EPQ lessons. So that is the manage, planning part of it, and that equates to 20% of the entire grade. So just a reminder that you'll see that throughout the project, but I think most of it will be concentrated in the production log in Project Q. Almost all of AO2 will come from the report, because this, of course, is the resources. Now, of course, just to remind you, especially if you're doing an artifact, the resources don't have to be written. They can be interviews with people, they can be primary research, they can be surveys, they can be questionnaires, so you can use primary data. But for most of our students who are doing a written report, it will be a literature review. And I just want to remind you that the whole idea of the EPQ is it's beyond A-level, so this is really important. They should never be using A-level sources at all, no textbooks or anything like that. And ideally, they should be looking at journal articles. So they might sort of quote something like the Daily Mail occasionally, but that's usually to dismiss it for being a shallow source. On the whole, they should be looking at expert journals, working through Google Scholar, and EBSCO and JSTOR. And in order to get into the top band, you would be looking for 20 plus good sources. If you're getting into the sum, the middle band here, you'd be maybe looking at, this is roughly speaking, guys, 10 to 15. And then below 8 or 10, you'd be looking at limited, and it would be sort of unsatisfactory. Just want to pause very quickly to say it's not enough for them to do detailed research. They must show critical analysis and evaluation of the sources. And we spend quite a lot of time in the EPQ lessons learning to challenge and evaluate sources, whether it's using NOT-TC as you would in history, Jack, or whether it's using the CRAP method, which they teach in American universities, or whether it's using scientific challenges or quantitative data challenges in economics. They must interrogate the sources and discuss that. So they'd be looking to assimilate and cross-reference and challenge and make sure that they are looking at peer-reviewed studies, etc., no matter what the discipline is. If it's an artifact, that might be speaking to various people. So if they're doing a piece of engineering, they might speak to a number of technical people and make sure that they agree with one another or find out what the differences are. Now moving on, assessment objective number 3, which is called develop and realize, is the most important. It's 40% of the grade, so it is really the most important one. And they break it down for us helpfully to say problem solving, decision making, creative thinking, and the ability to achieve planned outcomes. Okay? So where would we find this? We would find it everywhere in the project. We would find it in the production log. They'll tell you about their decision making. So you remember earlier I said it's desirable for them to make changes. They must substantiate those changes and explain exactly why it is they've made this particular change. So it can be a very useful technique, guys, to do something like this. I encourage my students to do tables, to say I had option B, C, A, B, and C. This is what A was, this is what B was, this is what C was. I have evaluated them, and in the end I decided that option C would be the best decision for me for the following reasons. So I'm constantly getting them to try and evidence why it is they come to certain decisions, what was the strategy they used for overcoming problems and challenges, how did they identify these weaknesses. So a really important thing is for them to absolutely embrace their failures, providing they are productive failures. So if they're saying, I really hit an impasse or a difficulty here, etc., that's fabulous, as long as they then say, and then I looked for a solution and I arrived at this particular solution, okay? So that's really important. And in terms of develop and realize, you can find it in the report, especially in the literature review section. That's when they're looking and evaluating their sources. They might find it in terms of things like quantitative data, where they're looking at numbers and data, they're sifting through, they're checking, they're evaluating whether that data is valid or not. They're looking at things like correlation does not equal causation, etc. They're looking for things like logical fallacies or faulty reasoning, exaggeration, extrapolation. These are all techniques that I teach them. So really they're the bare bones of critical thinking. And again, you've got the 3 bands. You've got clear, you've got some, and you've got limited there. So extremely important criteria, AO3 there. So that's why it's so important when they have these conversations with you as a supervisor that you remind them that they must be tracking their thinking and explaining it, etc. And of course, that research question, when it changes, should be given a very, very clear rationale for those changes, okay? Then the final piece of, the final assessment criteria is called review. It's an odd one because it sort of puts together various different things. You'll notice here communication skills. So just a reminder, of course, that would be both in the written form. So there you would be looking at the report. But equally important, of course, would be the presentation. And the presentation is an absolutely key element of the EPQ. I should have said earlier, just to go back quickly, guys, the problem solving and decision making can be discussed in the presentation. And just as a quick aside, as a supervisor, if you know your students have done some amazing problem solving, they've not said it in the presentation, then you ask them about it in the Q&A session of the presentation, okay? So, going back to AO3 then, communication skills, both written and formal and verbal. Presenting evidence outcomes and conclusions. So you would look for that in the conclusion, and I think in terms of the production log, you would look for it in the final part of the production log, which is the summary and reflection. So this AO4. And then the final thing would be the self-evaluation bit. That's the bit where they critique themselves and stuff. So just a quick reminder that there is no individual mark allocation for criteria. It doesn't say, for instance, the presentation is worth 10 or 50%, etc. You go for it across, it's an organic whole, and the thing to remember is that AO3 is the most important one. That's the problem-solving one. And the other thing to remember is just the 3 bands that I mentioned. So it's a best fit category. You'd say to yourself, are they best in the clear? Are they best in the sum? It's not always there, it's sometimes there. Or have they slipped really into the limited, where I cannot see these things very often, okay? Your mark is out of 50. And inside the project queue, you have to write a comment for each of the AOs. I will send you some comments, a good one, a middle one, and a bad one, and you can use those to form your own comment, okay? So that's how the assessment criteria work and how you would evaluate the mark overall. So I'm just going to end this short video about the assessment criteria, just saying how this sheet can be very useful, okay? So you see that what I've done is put here the manage together, the AO1, and then you would just find the appropriate ones. It may not be that they just clearly in one set. It may be that, you know, the clear identification of the topic is there, but you only found an appropriate plan. So then you sort of judge to yourself, are they more in 2 or more in 3? And that's what you would put down. And the same goes with the resources. You know, have they used detailed, clear resources? Or is it the case that they've sometimes used, you know, clear resources, etc.? And then this is the big one, isn't it? The AO3, the develop and realize, that's all the problem solving. Is there appropriate decision-making selection throughout? Is there always clear evidence? If that's the case, then it will go into number 3. But if it's, you know, there most of the time, then it may be that they go the top of 2. And then finally, the review bit is where they do the self-evaluation. So I always send this sheet out to the supervisors because I think this helps you imagine the mark as a whole.